So you have a standard binding equilibrium there. That when you have irreversible inhibitors, things that when you form a covalent bond, you have that second inactivation step, right? And so when we think about evaluating those irreversible inhibitors, we talked about that K inactive or Ki, right? You have to think about evaluating a little bit of a different way, because if you put an irreversible inhibitor onto an enzyme and let it sit forever, it will eventually inactivate the enzyme, regardless of its binding affinity. So we have to think about it a little bit differently. Okay? Now, there are a variety of irreversible inhibitors of enzymes. We talked a lot about penicillins. I put up here a structure of a cephalosporin, which is, as you can all tell, very closely related to the penicillins. In particular, you'll notice that we have our beta-lactam reactive group, or warhead, right there in the middle of the molecule. Okay? We have disulfiram, which we'll talk about in a second, which is a very interesting compound, both in its history and what it's used for medically. We have nerve gases, which technically, normally we wouldn't think of as drugs, right? Because you don't use them therapeutically, one hopes. But they're the same thing, they're irreversible inhibitors, right? We talked about that diisopropyl fluorophosphonate before, right? We had that molecule, right? We talked about this with chymotrypsin, right? And how it modifies the active site serine in chymotrypsin. I just wanted to mention about how we don't use it in my laboratory because I don't want to nerve gas my students, right? Here's another one. So who's heard of VX? A few people, okay? This is one of the nastier legacies of the Cold War, okay? This is, it's a molecule that came out of development. It all started back with the G series of nerve gases that came out of Germany during World War II. This was eventual development on this, and depending on how you talk to, this was developed either by us or by the Russians, depending on who wants to take credit or doesn't want to take credit for it, okay? But as you'll notice here, these are still, all of these nerve gases tend to be acetylcholinesterase inhibitors, okay? So remember how we talked about acetylcholine as a neurotransmitter, okay? During nerve conduction, the nerve cell, as you do those neurotransmitter communication, one nerve cell will release acetylcholine into the synapse. It goes down to the next nerve cell, binds to a GPCR, and activates signaling in the next cell. In order to reset that signal, the acetylcholine has to get hydrolyzed to choline and to acetic acid, okay, in order to reset the signal. Acetylcholinesterase inhibitors block that basically by, once you put the acetylcholine into the synapse, these inhibit the enzyme that recycles the signal. So in a way, one interesting thing about that effect, right, is it's not that it blocks the neurotransmitter, it blocks the ability of the nerve to reset, okay? Now what you have here, right, you can see sort of the comparison. We have a fluorophosphonate here. We have a modified phosphorus electrophile right there. But it's going to work in the same way. It's going to modify that serine in the acetylcholinesterase. Okay? And so what it's going to do is modify that, block the enzyme that degrades acetylcholine, and your nerve signals go to nuts, and you end up suffocating because your diaphragm won't work anymore, which is not ideal. Okay? What's interesting about that, I was looking it up, that the antidote to VX poison doesn't actually help acetylcholinesterase. What it does is it modifies another receptor to help reset the signal. You guys have heard of atropine? Okay, who's seen the movie The Rock? Like 40? Wow. Okay. Or we see people like they have the injector, like thought to inject themselves as they get nerve gas. It's actually a second molecule that modifies, that interacts with a second receptor to help keep the signal going. Okay? But that's an example of a irreversible enzyme inhibitor that obviously has an effect on a biological system. Okay? Then down here we have a proton pump inhibitor, which is involved if you or your relatives routinely take something to deal with antacids, like Prilosec or whatever. These are molecules, they tend to be PPIs, proton pump inhibitors. They block production of protons into your stomach to keep the acidity down, okay? And this is an interesting molecule, as we're going to show, because it gets activated by the body to serve as an irreversible inhibitor, okay, as a covalent inhibitor. And we already talked about orlistat before, that here with this black tone where it modifies the serine into lipase. Okay? So these all follow the same pattern we talked about before, that these irreversible inhibitors usually have an electrophilic warhead. Okay? So when you look at these molecules, or if you look at a molecule trying to evaluate just looking at it, what type of inhibitor it might be, if you see electrophilic groups like these type of molecules, these type of functional groups, start thinking irreversible inhibition. Okay? If you see a strong electrophile. Okay. So omeprazole, or omeprazole, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it correct. Okay? So the way this works, which is very interesting, okay, is, so this is the drug that's in your bloodstream, goes through your cell membrane, okay, and you start going through some chemical changes. And what's going to happen is that it actually goes through several metabolic steps to make this activated intermediate. Okay? It is then that activated intermediate that interacts with a thiol on a histone, essentially on a histone potassium transporter that's an ATPase. Now, here's one issue where you think about how you describe drugs, is that if we thought about this enzyme, so the proton pump, effectively, when we think about what it does, it's a transporter, okay? And it's actually doing active transport. So it's not like the ion channels we talked about before, where you have an ion gradient, you open the door, and just by equilibrium, sort of sodium will go through, potassium will go through, or what have you, okay? Proton pumps have to send protons against a chemical gradient, so they have to use ATP to do that, ATP hydrolysis. In this case, what happens is this drug, once you form the activated intermediate here, okay, it is going to go through and modify the cysteine in the ATPase domain of that transporter. Okay? The reason I'm talking a little bit about this is that when you think about this proton pump, think about it, you would think of it more as a transporter than you would think about it as an enzyme, right? Because its role is not actually to hydrolyze ATP, right? That's not what it's doing to maintain or increase or change biological function. Its role is to move protons. What happens, though, is it has to couple to an enzymatic activity to do that. You can block this transporter by blocking the enzyme that's part of it, okay? So that's how these inhibitors work. They actually block the ability to couple ATP hydrolysis to proton transport, okay? Any questions on that? Okay. So that's something else we'll think about when you think about enzyme inhibitors, that if we look at molecules that aren't classically enzymes, right, that you can look at them and try to block them if they couple to an enzyme activity or to an enzyme partner. You can use enzyme inhibition to block what we think of as a non-enzymatic process, like proton transport. Okay. So that was omeprazole. Now, you don't need to know all of these steps or all the chemistry. I deliberately sort of said 3 steps here, just to make a point. Know that there are some drugs that get activated inside the cell. We're going to talk about this a lot more in a little bit when we talk about suicide substrates. Okay? Okay, now we have disulfiram, which is that molecule in the upper right corner. What disulfiram is used, it's marketed, and I put up there, its trade name is Antabuse. Okay? What disulfiram does, or does anybody ever know someone, not say who, anybody know someone who has taken this? Okay. What it does is effectively, this is used as a treatment for, among other things, for alcoholism. Okay? What this molecule will do is if you take disulfiram and you drink alcohol, you will become sick as a dog. Okay? What it's going to do is we talked a little bit about alcohol metabolism before in the context when we talked about if you get ethylene glycol poisoning, the way they treat you is throw ethanol into you, right? You're trying to block the enzyme. That would turn diethylene glycol into something that's into glycoside, which is really, really bad for you, okay? Normally when ethanol goes through, so this is the normal ethanol metabolism. You get rid of 2 or 10% just by excretion, unmodified. Some enzymes in your microsomes will do a little bit of work on it, but the majority of it tends to go through this enzyme, alcohol dehydrogenase, okay? Which is really, really strongly expressed in your liver, among other places, okay? In the first step, you're going to take ethanol. Okay, so you got ethanol. The first step is going to take you to acetaldehyde. Okay? So you can see how we've oxidized that carbon basically one step. Okay? Okay. So you get to acetaldehyde. Now, acetaldehyde is bad for you, okay? Because the issue is, ethanol actually isn't going to do too much to you. It mucks with your receptors, which is why people get drunk, but it doesn't actually cause a lot of problem. We actually can use that as an energy source if need be. Acetaldehyde can start doing some really nasty chemistry on proteins, right? Because we made this aldehyde, that's an electrophilic center, okay? So we go from something that's, I'm not going to say it's good for you, but it's not horrible for you, okay? Not advocating drinking, but to something that is actually biochemically kind of dangerous, having this around, okay? In normal metabolism, we would then have that molecule be modified by a different dehydrogenase, which is going to take it another oxidation to acetic acid. Okay? Once we get here, then either you can excrete this very easily, right? Goes in your blood, gets buffered out. We can make acetyl-CoA, go into metabolism, right? So this is how we actually get energy out of alcohol, right? We take it down here, it gets it into acetyl-CoA, to a 2-carbon acid, and then into fatty acid metabolism. Okay? So the issue is when you drink, and if you get a hangover, okay, your hangover is primarily due to acetaldehyde, okay, because this will build up in your bloodstream. You guys have all heard the whole rule of thumb that you can metabolize 1 drink per hour, right? That's basically the rate at which this enzyme goes, okay? The problem is if you have more than that, okay, you start getting acetaldehyde. That acetaldehyde is one of the major things that makes you feel like you have a hangover. Causes the dehydration, the nausea, the headache, all that stuff. Okay? What disulfiram will do is it inhibits the aldehyde dehydrogenase. Okay? The enzyme is doing this conversion. What that means is that if you have disulfiram in your system, if you drink any alcohol at all, you have basically you're stuck in a hangover. There's no way to get rid of this molecule. And so you get all those fun side effects. You know, headache, nausea, vomiting, low blood pressure, okay? Now, one of the cool things about this drug is how it was discovered, okay? Has anybody heard of how disulfiram was discovered? Okay, it was not drug development. What happened is many, many moons ago in rubber factories. You guys all heard the whole story of vulcanization of rubber, yes? By Charles Goodyear? Okay, right, he dropped sulfur on it, it got to be a lot better, okay? So during production of rubber, you end up using sulfur-containing reagents to basically reduce the, to oxidize the rubber, okay? In the plant, they were using that molecule, disulfiram, as a reagent in rubber manufacture. What they found is the workers in the plant found they could no longer drink alcohol. Right? They would go out for a tall frosty one after work, and they'd all get sick. They finally worked it back and found out that that was the active compound. Okay? What this actually is going to do is modify a thiol in the active site of aldehyde dehydrogenase and block its activity. Okay? But now people will now use this as part of a treatment regimen to treat alcoholism. You'll treat someone who's recovering with disulfiram, and so effectively it turns into a combination of drug treatment and psychological conditioning, right? That if you're on, and once you take this, it stays in your system for like 2 weeks for each dose. It sticks around forever. If you take a drink, you get horribly sick, okay? And it's an interesting example both in how it works on the enzyme, but also the idea that you're actually using a drug to make someone sick, right? Not to help cure the hangover, but to actually induce it. Yeah.
So when you use disulfiram, you get like all those like headaches and symptoms. So does it digest the alcohol, or do you get like alcohol poisoning because you have that?
So you won't. I don't think you will get alcohol poisoning because I don't know the whole literature on it. My understanding of what I read about the effects of this, I don't think you would get alcohol poisoning because you couldn't drink enough alcohol to get poisoning. Like it happens very quickly because you can't break down this product, and this is what makes you feel sick. So what's going to happen is eventually you will excrete this, right? It'll filter out of your blood and you'll excrete it. But if you don't have an enzyme breaking it down, that clearance rate is much, much, much lower, okay? And so it's just, yeah, you're basically in a place where you just cannot get rid of it, and you're just going to be sick until you get rid of it, Okay, but it's not like classical alcohol poisoning, right? So that's my understanding.
But the first alcohol dehydrogenase works. So
Yes, this first one works.
Clear
Yes.
ethanol just fine.
Right. In comparison, there is a condition, especially among some Asian subpopulations, where they have a mutation in alcohol dehydrogenase. Okay, and so there are certain people who have a genetic predisposition when they drink. They will get tipsy really fast off of like 2 or 3 beers. The issue there is they have a deficiency in this enzyme. Okay, and so the ethanol stays in their bloodstream. Now remember, so this ethanol is what mucks with your receptors. Is what mucks is the neurologically active molecule here. That causes a hangover. That can give. That's why you have low calorie beer. Okay, and so depending on which enzyme gets mucked with, if you muck with this enzyme, you actually would stay quote unquote drunk longer because it takes you longer to get rid of the ethanol. Okay. Another interesting tidbit from this. There are genetic studies that show that people who have a family history of alcoholism, many of them will have higher constitutive rates of expression of that enzyme. Okay? So in order to actually get drunk, they have to drink more alcohol. Okay? But yeah, so it's an interesting use of an irreversible inhibitor as sort of almost a preventative treatment or part of a support treatment in terms of helping to cure alcohol abuse through inhibition of a specific enzyme. Okay? Okay, so that's irreversible. Those are, we did competitive inhibitors and irreversible inhibitors. The common effect on both of those, we're talking about inhibitors that bind in the enzyme active site. Okay? Now we're going to talk a lot about allosteric inhibitors, which we mentioned before in context of just overall enzyme background. The difference to these allosteric inhibitors in particular, they're binding outside the active site. Right? There's a distinct allosteric site that these molecules will bind into that will affect enzyme activity. Okay? Now, there's our author's favorite concept, induced fit, does occur. Okay? It'll bind in, it'll change the active site. Now, this can work in a few different ways. There are allosteric inhibitors that actually, as are shown here, can actually shrink the active site to the point that you actually can't bind your substrate anymore. Okay? There are allosteric inhibitors that will bind in, you will still bind the substrate just fine, but it'll reorganize the active site of the enzyme so you'll bind substrate but catalysis won't occur or won't occur as readily. Okay? So there are a number of different mechanisms by which you can get allosteric inhibition. The one constant here is allosteric inhibitors bind distal from the active site. Okay? Now when we think about that, and it's kind of pointed out by the last point here, one of the difficulties in designing ab initio allosteric inhibitors, since we're not binding in the active site, is there any requirement the allosteric inhibitor looks anything like the substrate? No, we don't know. In fact, very often, the first allosteric inhibitor toward a class of enzymes is serendipity. It's complete luck about knowing that it binds in, and then you have the inhibitor. In terms of modern drug development, a lot of this is structure-based. So you'll find a molecule that inhibits the enzyme, you'll get a crystal structure of the enzyme with the inhibitor, and you'll find out it's not in the active site, it's somewhere else. Okay? So it's much, on the start of it, it's much harder to find allosteric inhibitors if you don't know something about the enzyme, because you don't have a molecular scaffold to work in context of, unlike these competitive inhibitors that look like the substrate or the product. Okay? So here are 2 examples of allosteric inhibitors. This first one, 6-mercaptopurine, which is an anti-cancer drug. Okay? This is involved in inhibiting biosynthesis of purine nucleosides. Okay? What this is this is you can see where this is an analog of purine. Okay? You can see where this would go into adenosine synthesis, it would go into guanosine synthesis. Okay? Many of these pathways have feedback inhibition. Right? We talked about that before. The enzymes, you'll have a biosynthetic pathway that goes A, goes to B, goes to C, goes to D, where the concentration of D, the end product, can regulate the activity of the first enzyme. So if you get a lot of the product, it will feed back and block the activity of the early enzymes. You don't continue making D if you don't need more of it. Okay? For a lot of these allosteric inhibitors, what they will do is they'll work in these feedback pathways by mimicking the product of the biosynthetic pathway. So 6-mercaptopurine is a mimic of purine, is a mimic of the product of purine biosynthesis. Okay? Now, particular, this has been used as a chemotherapeutic for a long time. Particularly, it's being used in the treatment of leukemia and blood cancers. Okay. Over on the other side, we have a more recently developed inhibitor, this trametinib. Okay. It inhibits kinases and MAP-ERK signaling pathways. So these would be these would be enzymes in a pathway. Usually, these would be downstream of RTKs, as we talked about. So you have receptor tyrosine kinase. They'll go through RAS or RHO. And then these will be the kinases further down that pathway. Okay? Now that molecule is used in the treatment of metastatic melanoma, so a skin cancer. Okay? The other thing to look at is that these kinases, as their substrates, they're using either an enzyme, so serine or threonine on an enzyme, or a downstream partner, and they use ATP. If you look at this molecule, it looks nothing like either one of those. Okay? And so that's the other thing with allosteric inhibitors. They don't have to resemble the substrate or the product. Okay? Now, we talked about this a little bit before, particularly when you're working on enzymes that are a member in a large class, like kinases, like phosphatases. Okay? Trying to design allosteric inhibitors might give you a better chance for selectivity because while the active sites are going to be conserved in those enzymes, the allosteric sites might not be. Okay? So if you find an allosteric site, it gives you a better chance of hitting certain kinases without inhibiting other ones, because while they all have to bind ATP, not all of them have to have a site that will bind this molecule. Okay? Okay. And so how that's going to work is allosteric inhibitors will give us non-competitive inhibition. Right? We talked about competitive before, where we had one active site, you either have the inhibitor or you can have the substrate. With non-competitive inhibition, you have an inhibitor, it can bind to free enzyme, or it can bind to the enzyme substrate complex, okay? And put this down into this side of the curve. Now, as drawn here, we're saying that any form of the enzyme inhibitor complex does not support product production. That is not always the case. Some of them will have the ability to do chemistry, it'll just be lower, okay? So allosteric inhibition doesn't have to take you to 0, it just is going to take you down some amount, right? So it could be 5-fold less active, 10-fold less active, whatever. Now the difference here is, as drawn, remember when we think about the enzyme, we started out with, we have our KCAT and our KM, right? We have KCAT, the fastest the enzyme can go if we give it all the substrate it can deal with. And we have KM, the amount of substrate it takes for us to get to half that maximal rate. Okay? With non-competitive inhibition, since we're binding outside the active site, right? So we draw, right? So here's our active site. There's our allosteric site. Right? Whether or not we have the inhibitor in here is not affecting that active site at all in terms of its ability to bind substrate, classically. Okay? And so what happens is as we add inhibitor in, as we take the enzyme population from free enzyme to enzyme inhibitor complex, we do not necessarily have to change the enzyme's ability to interact with its substrate. Okay? So classic, pure, non-competitive inhibition, we see the KM completely unchanged. Effectively, the amount of substrate we need to bind to get to half maximal activity is exactly the same. What changes is as we add in more and more and more allosteric inhibitor, non-competitive inhibitor, is we're changing the enzyme from what I would call sort of a high activity state to a low activity state. Okay? So if we force it all the way down here, what you're going to see as your KCAT, your Vmax, the fastest enzyme can go, is going to be a function of how much of the enzyme has inhibitor not there or inhibitor there. And so what you're going to see is your Km doesn't change, but your Vmax does change, okay? So this would be the first way you would tell between a competitive and a non-competitive inhibitor, okay? Because the inhibitor and the substrate aren't binding in the same place, there is no way for the substrate to compete the inhibitor out, okay? And so what you're going to see is if you look at your velocity versus substrate curves here, that's no inhibitor. This is if we have the concentration of the inhibitor equal to Ki. So that means that we're 50-50 enzyme or enzyme inhibitor. as we keep adding more and more and more inhibitor, it's dropping. But if you notice where the halfway point is, and it's a little hard to see with the lower curves, okay? But we look at that one. So we're up to about 90%, halfway is about there. This one, we're up to about 40%, so halfway is about there. Notice, that's the exact same concentration, okay? So the Km does not change. Now, if we think about developing this in terms of targeting enzymes in the body, okay? So far we have competitive inhibition, and we have non-competitive inhibition. Now, if you are going to inhibit an enzyme, target an enzyme in a pathway where there's a lot of flux, so there's a lot of, so like a metabolic enzyme, or a kinase, or a glycosylase, something where you have a lot of substrate around all the time, does it make more sense, do you think, to try to develop a competitive inhibitor or a non-competitive inhibitor? If you have a large substrate pool in the cell. Within non-competitive, because non-competitive, you don't have to compete with the substrate, right? Now, if you have an enzyme that has very low levels of substrate around, either one works, okay? But what it also means, and we talked about this with competitive inhibitors, how you get into an arms race with the cell, right? Where you block it, it makes more substrate, and eventually the cell might win. Allosteric inhibitors can't do that. Yes?
Do all enzymes have allosteric?
No.
Okay.
Do all enzymes have allostery? No, they don't. A lot of them do, but not all of them do. Okay? And there are some arguments about even enzymes we find that have allostery. Is the allostery part of their natural regulation, or is it something we just lucked into? Like with a lot of these, like with the kinases, is that allosteric site actually binding something in the cell that helps regulate the enzyme, or are we finding a way that you found there's a patch on the enzyme that we find out chemical and it mucks the kinase up, so it's completely sort of synthetic? There are some arguments about that. Like molecules like this, definitely allostery is there in their feedback loops. But there could be an argument. If you find allostery on an enzyme, it doesn't mean it's used naturally, and you don't always know that an enzyme has allostery, right? So in a lot of these, again, if you find an allosteric inhibitor, it would be more, you do a screen or you have compounds, you check the enzyme and say, okay, when I look at it, what mode of inhibition is it using, okay? And then we would go back, and particularly we'd look at our Langmuir-Burke plot, okay? And what we're going to see here is this is non-competitive inhibition, so this would be classically allostery, okay? What you notice here again, remember we said that Km is unchanged, but Vmax changed, okay? What that means is that, remember that with the competitive inhibitor, they crossed on the y-axis, and they had different values over here. With non-competitive, it's exactly opposite, okay? They're the same on the x-axis, because the x-axis, this is this reads out Km, the Vmax changes, okay? So what's nice here is just by looking at a Langmuir-Burke plot, and right, all this data can come from that curve, okay? Simply by looking at a Langmuir-Burke plot, if I give you a Langmuir-Burke plot, right, and you have one, right, so this is 0, and let's say that's 1, versus that Langmuir-Burke plot, right, this is competitive, that's non-competitive, and it jumps right off the plot at you, okay? So this, I would say, in terms of modern use of this, and again, this sort of analysis goes back to before we had nonlinear fitting, back before we used on computers to fit the data. This is the way that Langmuir-Burkes are usually used now to very rapidly assign mode of inhibition. Okay? Okay. So those were competitive, uncompetitive. Oh, sorry, non-competitive. Now we have the third one, which uncompetitive. Now, those of you who read from biochemistry, I'll be honest, I do enzymology for a living. I always have trouble keeping uncompetitive and non-competitive straight. Okay? So, I'm right there with you. Okay. I try to remember that uncompetitive is the really complicated one. Okay? Now, what happens with uncompetitive inhibition, classically speaking, is that you have an inhibitor that only binds to the enzyme substrate complex. Okay? So, for example, here, remember, with an allosteric inhibitor, sometimes you'll see it just binding to the enzyme, but it can stick around afterwards. Okay? With uncompetitive, it only binds to the ES complex, which is kind of weird. I will tell you, while we talk about this, there are vanishingly small numbers of enzymes that display pure uncompetitive inhibition. It's not very common to find it. Okay? But when we look at that, what actually happens with this enzyme, which is kind of funky, okay, is that you end up having something that looks a little bit like it's still allosteric in that you go to a low activity enzyme state, and so your Vmax drops. So this part of it, notice, is exactly the same as this. Okay? So we're going to see Vmax drop. As we add more inhibitor in, we populate an enzyme inhibitor complex which has lower activity. The weird thing to uncompetitive is because we only bind to the enzyme substrate complex. What that actually is going to do is it's going to deplete the population of only ES. So by Le Chatelier's principle, what that actually is going to do is push this toward, at a given substrate concentration, pushes this toward the ES complex because we're drawing it away to the ES inhibitor complex. So what we see is actually Km is reduced. So it also, in order to get to half maximal activity, you actually need less substrate than you might otherwise. Okay? And so if you look at this, where the dotted lines are, notice, so this is the Km for the uninhibited enzyme. Over here is the Km for the inhibited enzyme. So Km drops. Okay? What we have with uncompetitive is both Km and Kcat change. Okay? Then if you do your Lineweaver-Burke plot, you get a third pattern where you get parallel lines. Okay? So if you want to keep, the way you try to keep it straight along with sort of the overall, the mechanism of what's going in, what you remember is with competitive inhibition, Km changes, with non-competitive, Kcat changes, with uncompetitive, both change. Okay? Now again, I told you that it's very uncommon to see pure uncompetitive inhibition. There are a lot of inhibitors that are referred to as mixed inhibitors, okay? Which means that you can have an inhibitor that shows both non-competitive and uncompetitive character. Now what's in common here with non-competitive and uncompetitive, they're both binding outside the active site, okay? In order to be competitive, you have to bind on the active site. There's no two ways about it. Now if you think about it, the only difference here, okay, so this is the non-competitive we talked about. What would matter is if the binding affinity of the substrate to this complex, if this binding is different than that binding. If it's different, you actually would see uncompetitive inhibition, right? You'd see the Km change. And so that's what you want to keep in mind. If you hear people talk about mixed inhibitors or mixed inhibition as you read about the drugs in the course and when the 614 people are developing your presentations, what that means is you see both non-competitive and uncompetitive behavior. Okay? So any questions on those? Yes?
So
Go ahead.
so for uncompetitive, is it like the substrate will bind to the enzyme and does it just open up another site?
That is one mechanism. That would be a classic mechanism for it. Yeah, that the allosteric site where this inhibitor is binding in doesn't exist until the substrate binds. Right. Which would also mean, yeah, so, and then it couples in that if it opens up a site, that would mean the binding energy from putting the inhibitor in feeds back to the substrate, right? So they're energetically coupled to each other. So that would be a classical explanation. Yeah, the inhibitor, the allosteric site doesn't exist until the substrate binds. Now if you have a mixed inhibitor, it could be that the allosteric site's there, but the binding becomes tighter when the substrate's bound in. Right? It's all about how the two sites communicate to each other. Yeah.
Basically the same question. I was wondering if there's like a structural change that occurs when you have an allosteric site.
Generally, yeah, in order to have allosteric, you have to have some kind of structural change. Now, it may not be, it can be very small, just moving some small amino acid, 1 or 2 amino acid side chains changing. It can be complete domain rearrangements.
So can it like change where the active site is?
It depends on what you mean by change where the active site is. I mean, the substrate's going to bind, in the extreme, binding of an allosteric inhibitor could eliminate the active site, right, could basically put amino acids into that deep groove where the active site is could no longer exist. Now, in terms of moving to a second active site, while I would say that's not likely, I'm not going to completely rule it out. Okay. Classically, what you're going to have is it's going to rearrange, either make it so the substrate doesn't bind as well, or it's going to rearrange active site catalytic residue so it can't do catalysis. And again, just reiterate, so we had competitive inhibitors bind in the active site, uncompetitive and non-competitive bind outside the active site. Okay. And just to remind you, I threw this back up here, just to remind you what the reversible competitive inhibitors look like. Okay? So again, that's what the benefit of the Langmuir-Burke is. Just by looking at the shape of these curves, you know what your inhibition mode is. Okay? Okay. So those are allosteric inhibitors, and there's a lot of them. We will be talking about them through the course, and each time we talk about drugs going forward, one of the central things people need to know about when you develop a new drug is the mode of inhibition. Okay? And this is where you have entomologists come in. Once you've made a molecule, how does it work? Okay. So now we're going to talk a little bit about strategies for making better inhibitors. Okay? And we're going to talk about two different strategies that fall within the larger family of what's called mechanism-based inhibitor design. Okay? First, we're going to talk about our transition state analogs, the TSA, which are these are not molecules that stop you from getting on planes. So, you look at, sorry, after this began too soon. When we think about transition state analogs, what these are effectively a recognition that what enzymes are built to do is to bind and stabilize the transition state of a reaction. Right? You guys all remember this curve from like the first week of class, right? Now, what it is about that transition state, remember, is that transition state, so going from the substrate to the product, you are going through an unstable chemical intermediate that has very distinct structural and electronic properties from either the substrate or the product, right? As we talked about, say, when we did the classical competitive inhibitors, right? We talked about things that look like the substrate or look like the product, okay? Now, the thing is, in order to achieve catalysis, the enzyme has to bind and has to use its structure to stabilize actually this transition state to get catalysis. And so if we want to develop a molecule that's an even better competitive inhibitor of this enzyme than, say, a substrate or a product analog, what you want to do is design a molecule that mimics the transition state of the reaction itself. Okay? That will outcompete both substrate and product. Okay? Now, okay, you can read through that, blah, 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 blah. Okay? The trick to it is that transition states are not stable. Right? By definition, they don't exist because we can't see them. Okay? So what you have to come up with, I'll go back to this last point, sorry. You have to design a chemically stable compound that mimics the reaction intermediate. So you have to use chemical tricks and chemical reasoning to develop a molecule that's going to mimic what the middle state of that reaction looks like. But something that's stable enough you can actually use it as a drug. Okay? What this also means is in order to do transition state analog development, we have to really understand the mechanism of the enzyme. Okay? And this is, and again, truth in advertising, I'm completely not subjective about this because it's part of what I do for my research. But this is where mechanistic enzymology comes in, is understanding exactly how the enzyme catalyzes a reaction. By understanding the reaction pathway, you understand what the transition state looks like, how it might be stabilized, and that gives you clues as to what kind of molecules you would need to make to bind in and mimic the transition state. Okay? So we'll talk one example that was given in your book, this renin inhibitor. So renin, right here, is an enzyme, a protease, is involved in the conversion of angiotensinogen to angiotensin 1. So this is a protein that's involved in blood pressure regulation, right? We already talked about ACE inhibitors over there, remember? We had them as the reversible inhibitors, all involved in regulating your blood pressure, okay? So renin is a protease, and we've already talked, it's like chymotrypsin. So the good news is we already have a pretty good idea how that reaction works, right? So it's going to block synthesis of angiotensin 1 and 2. Now the problem with renin, right? So we can think about using inhibitors like sort of like that PMSF or the diisopropylfluorophosphonate, although not as strong as those. We can try using those inhibitors on renin. What I'll tell you is those inhibitors don't work, okay, at all on renin. The issue with renin is while it is a protease, it is a different type of protease than chymotrypsin or trypsin, okay? And so when you look in, the first step to doing transition state analog development is actually knowing what the mechanism is. Okay, so here is the mechanism of renin hydrolysis of angiotensinogen. Okay, what we have is like any other protease, we have our peptide bond. Now the difference is here, we have multiple classes of proteases. Chymotrypsin and trypsin are what we call serine proteases, right? We use that catalytic serine as a nucleophile. Renin is what we call an aspartic protease. And so what it uses is in its active site, it has two different aspartates. Okay? Now what they're going to do is activate this water molecule right here to serve as the electrophile. So if you want to make a comparison, right, that comparing it to chymotrypsin, we have general base. In chymotrypsin we have the histidine. Here we have this aspartate that's going to activate the water, similarly to how the histidine activates the serine in chymotrypsin. Now the trick is, with this reaction, where's the nucleophile coming from? Is it part of the enzyme? No, it's water. Okay? So if you throw in, say, diisopropylfluorophosphonate, one of those fluorophosphonates or sulfonyl fluoride, those inhibitors we talked about before, what's going to get modified? Is the enzyme going to get modified by, say, diisopropylfluorophosphonate? What's going to get modified? Water. And what's going to happen? Water's just going to diffuse out, and you're going to bring another molecule of water in. Which is why, when you think about renin, you can't use irreversible inhibitors in that way. Right? You don't actually, those only work on an enzyme where you actually have a nucleophile on the enzyme to modify. Okay? So we activate that water, it attacks it, and we all remember our sophomore organic chemistry where we go in and form the always wonderful tetrahedral intermediate. Okay? And then that's going to resolve with cleavage of the peptide bond, liberation of the amine on the right side over there, and the acid. Okay? Everybody remember this mechanism, or does anybody want me to go back through it? Oh, okay, good. Okay, so that's what we're working with. So when we look at this, right, we have what's we actually have an intermediate in here, right? Right here, which is going to be our closest resemblance to what the actual transition state of this reaction is going to be. Right? The actual transition state would be as the water attacks in, right, we're going to develop negative charge on that oxygen, go to what we think of classically. But what that means is if we want to throw in an inhibitor to block this enzyme, right, we can throw in something that mimics the peptide, and we talked about inhibitors like that before, straight competitive inhibitors, okay? Or we can throw in a product analog, which might not bind as tightly, but what's going to bind most tightly is something that looks exactly like this. Now the problem is, while that is an intermediate, it is not a transition state, can you make this and put it in a bottle? No, what's going to happen to it? Right, that basically you're going to have this go back to the carbonyl. It's going to extrude water. Either it's going to break apart like that, or it's going to extrude water and you're going to be back where you started. Okay? So what we need to develop is a molecule that looks exactly like that, but is chemically stable. So what we see is in the renin inhibitor aliskiren, okay? That down here, this part of the molecule is meant to mimic the upstream amino acid. This over here mimics the downstream amino acid, okay? So you can see how this is a bit of a valine mimic. This is something like maybe a tyrosine mimic, okay? What we see here is at where the cleavage would be occurring. So kind of orient, remember, okay, so here we have our active site. Here's our tetrahedral intermediate. It's right here. You can see over there, there's our reaction intermediate. We have the nitrogen and the general hydroxyl groups. Okay, this is our tetrahedral intermediate. In aliskiren, we're mimicking that by changing the nitrogen to a carbon and eliminating one of the hydroxyl groups. Okay? Now, what are the good parts and bad parts of this structure? Okay. So, why would this be a better mimic of the transition state than our starting point? They're like our substrate. So what makes aliskiren better than the substrate?
SP3 hybridized.
It's sp3 hybridized, right? So that's going to be it's going to be tetrahedral, okay? And that's a big deal with these molecules. That if you look in their mechanism, very often there will be a oxyanion hold. There's a person in the enzyme that's there to recognize this oxygen as it goes to tetrahedral, and it's out of plane. It's a different geometry, okay? So it's sp3 hybridized. This is non-planar, whereas the starting out amide is planar, okay? So that's one difference. Okay. What else is different? Why did we get rid of the nitrogen?
Getting rid of the leaving group so it won't break apart.
Right. Because even if you get rid of this one oxygen, right? So let's say we just got rid of that. The problem with that is still, that's an intermediate on the way to imine formation, right? And so that actually could reverse. By getting rid of the nitrogen, we've made that a non-hydrolyzable bond. Okay? And the other thing you look at is here we have 2 hydroxyls, there we have 1 hydroxyl. Why don't we have 2 hydroxyls? What's that?
It's kind of acetal, so
It'd be an acetal, right? So even if we got rid of the nitrogen, if we just had these 2 hydroxyls, it's going to dehydrate and form a ketone, which doesn't help us out. Okay? So when you do transition state analog development, it's always a balancing act of what can I incorporate that looks like the transition state, but is still chemically stable. Okay? So you can see how that's stable. It mimics one of the groups in the transition state, and aliskiren actually has much better binding to the enzyme than either the substrate or the product. Okay? So let's also think a little bit more broadly. What would be other, let's say we want to do this reaction. Okay. We're going to design a mimic, aliskiren 2.0. Okay? So we're starting out with our that's what we're starting with. Okay? And we have aliskiren here. Okay. What we have is with aliskiren, we get sp3 hybridization, so it's tetrahedral, and we have 1 hydroxyl group. Okay, great. Now, can we do better than this? Yeah.
But if you did a sulfhydryl instead of the second hydroxyl, is it going to dehydrate?
So you're thinking okay, so you're thinking, I'm not going to worry about stereochemistry, they're different, trust me, okay? You're thinking that?
Yeah.
Putting it out. So that would end up dehydrating, that would end up breaking down, okay? I like the idea though, okay, how do we change this? So you can put a nitrogen there, same issue, is because if we have the hydroxyl there on this carbon center, the equilibrium in a water environment is going to take it back, okay? Okay. So how do we get more? How do we make this look even more like this intermediate? What are some other ideas? So so I like you doing this with sulfhydryl or doing this. What's the problem with that chemistry? Right? If we have this molecule here, it's going to, so let's say we knock the nitrogen out. Okay? We said we can't do this because it'll form a ketone, right? It'll dehydrate. Why is it dehydrating? What's the problem there? Or let me rephrase. Where's the chemistry occurring that leads to dehydration? It's at that center right there, right? Okay, so identify your problem, think of a solution. Can anybody think of molecules that look like this, but they don't have the carbon problem child? Maybe a phosphate, right? Because when we thought about this, right, I'll draw up, okay, for example, that's part of the phosphodiester backbone of DNA, right? Now, we wouldn't want to throw this, we could try throwing that in. Problem is, this is going to hydrolyze, right? We have enzymes that are built to hydrolyze this. But what if we instead made those carbons? So instead of having a phosphotriester, we have a phosphonate. Okay? Now what do we have here? We have tetrahedral geometry on the phosphate. We actually have 2 oxygens right? So this would be something you can look at. Now, this may not be hydrolytically stable, but it'd be another way to attack it. Anybody have other ideas? Kind of this idea, like how do we mimic that transition state?
Siloxane.
So you're using silicon?
Yeah.
When you try silicon, the trick there would be it's going to be hydrolytically susceptible again. Sulfate, we can try sulfur. And I like you to throw it, use the whole periodic table if you can. Right? So we could do something like a sulfoxide, okay? Or a sulfonic acid. You get the idea, right? Now, this may not be that stable. That's going to be stable as a rock, right? So you're going to see this sometimes. If you have a tetrahedral intermediate like this, you'll see things like hydroxyethyl groups, like what we have in aliskiren. You may see people go to phosphates, go to sulfur. You're looking at a structure, comparing it to the substrate, and one part of it looks completely, what the hell were they thinking? Don't look at the atoms, look at the geometry, look at the chemistry, right? And what are they trying to mimic by the change they made? Okay? So you get the idea here. So when you look in drugs, you may see these groups as mimics for that molecule. Okay? Any questions on that? Okay? And I'll make a point as we talk through more and more molecules in the course, trying to point out where these groups are. So you can start seeing sort of equivalencies. Okay. So some of these molecules, right? So we have statins here, which we're going to hear about during the presentations later on. These are, I think they're in the top 3, top 4 most prescribed drugs out there anywhere right now. Okay, so these are involved in blocking cholesterol biosynthesis. You can see that same hydroxyethyl group that we saw with aliskiren. Okay. Here, and we talked about these ACE inhibitors before. Again, you can see where we're getting this tetrahedral intermediate, and we have an acid here. Same idea. You're trying to mimic that tetrahedral intermediate to a certain extent. And here's another protease inhibitor. You see the same idea, right? That even taking where you have an amide, trying to make a tetrahedral so that it mimics more the transition state than it mimics the substrate. Okay. So that's one idea in terms of mechanism-based design, transition state analogs. Another type of mechanism-based development is what the book calls suicide substrates, okay? Which is really an enzyme-generated irreversible inhibitor. Now, there's sometimes going to be a little bit of confusion, and honestly, the way the language the book used got me a little bit when I was reading it. Between when we talked about those irreversible inhibitors before and suicide substrates, okay, or suicide inhibitors. The way the book breaks it down, which I think is it's useful, is that in their structure themselves, suicide substrates are not reactive in comparison to, say, a classical irreversible inhibitor. So I keep talking about that disopropyl fluorophosphonate, right? So if we have a fluorophosphonate, we have this group. This thing can react with it's floating around and electrophilic as you add it in. Okay. Also, for example, this molecule, if you put it so if you throw it in your chymotrypsin, it hits that one serine chymotrypsin. Molecules like this, if you throw them in water, just regular old water, they're gone in 10 minutes. They hydrolyze. Okay. So that tells you that you don't need the enzyme to activate the electrophile. It's already electrophilic throwing it in. And the problem with using molecules like this as drugs, generally speaking, is that they're floating around with an active electrophile, they can modify lots of stuff, right? They can be very non-discriminate. And so that's where you'll get toxicity or off-target impact, okay? With suicide substrates, we're able to get molecules that as they are added into the system, they are not reactive. But part of the enzyme action itself, or part of the drug trafficking into the body, is going to activate it as a drug, okay? So the first example we'll talk about here is trifluoroalanine as a suicide substrate of alanine transaminase, okay? So alanine transaminase, effectively what this molecule does It's going to use pyridoxal phosphate, which we talked about a little bit before with enzymes. Effectively, it has an aldehyde on it. We're moving nitrogens around, and as we talked about before, if you move a nitrogen, chances are you have pyridoxal phosphate involved. Okay? What this is going to do is effectively take the nitrogen off alanine to make pyruvic acid. Okay? What we can use is trifluoroalanine acts as a inhibitor of this enzyme. Okay? Now, when you look at trifluoroalanine right at the beginning, notice that it's structurally very similar to alanine. The only difference is we have 3 fluorines here instead of hydrogens. Okay? So at first blush, if we looked at that molecule and I give you no other information, not even including the fact that it's on a slide telling you it's a suicide substrate, if you had to guess, what kind of inhibitor would you guess that would be? Let's say competitive versus non-competitive / uncompetitive. Who thinks it'd be more likely to be a competitive inhibitor? Who's for un or non-competitive? Allosteric. Okay. It's a substrate mimic, so it might be more likely to be competitive. Okay. Now, granted, when you would look at it, if you did your Langmuir-Burke plots, that would tell you very quickly that's not the case. Okay. But what we're going to see is when it binds on the enzyme, trifluoroalanine is going to use the enzyme's own chemical apparatus against it. Okay. So how does this work? Okay. Now, first we're going to go briefly through the mechanism of alanine transaminase as it normally works. And again, this goes back to the point when you do mechanism-based design, you have to know the mechanism first. Okay? So we have alanine, and we have our aldehyde here on pyridoxal phosphate. We have to do condensation. We form the imine on a pyridoxal phosphate. Okay? And then what we can do is by basically leveraging the positive charge down there, we end up making that carbon a lot more acidic. Okay? We deprotonate, we form that intermediate. So now we effectively have made it so that the nitrogen that was on alanine is now connected by more of an imine than it was in the original amine connection. And then you can hydrolyze there. Okay? So we hydrolyze it off, we end up getting pyruvate, and we end up getting the enamine version of pyridoxal phosphate. What's going to happen here is then you bring water back in here and it'll reverse and get ammonia off. Okay? So I'm not going in detail through the chemical mechanism. Again, as I go through this, if anybody else wants me to stop at arrow push, please tell me. Okay? Okay, so that's how alanine transaminase usually works. Now, what happens when we put in trifluoroalanine? Okay, so the first 3 steps are exactly the same, right? So, well, 2, I guess. We condense, and we deprotonate to form our imine intermediate. So, right here, that intermediate is exactly the same as that intermediate there, in terms of structure. The difference is, with trifluoroalanine, because we have the fluorines up there, what can happen is we can push the electrons backwards. And that's because when we have the fluorine up there, we have a leaving group available. Right? When with alanine, you have hydrogen. You are not kicking hydride off a molecule. Please, God, don't do that. And so what's going to happen is fluorine is going to leave, and what that's going to do is end up moving the double bond up here to that carbon. Okay? Now, that is only possible because we have that leaving group. Okay? What that generates then is this alkene here, this difluoroalkene. Okay? This is a really, really good electrophile. Because you can see basically what your setup here is for a conjugate addition. Right? Okay. It's something we're going to see in common with a lot of suicide substrates. You effectively have an enzyme-generated electrophile. Okay? Remember we talked about irreversible inhibitors all had those electrophilic groups on them? The epoxides and the mycoacceptors and the alpha halides, what have you. Suicide substrates, you generate that electrophile as part of the enzyme's action itself. Okay? At this point, then, we're going to have the enzyme nucleophile, so this can be a hydroxyl, this can be an amine, this could be histidine, whatever. It's going to attack in here, do a Michael addition, attack in, basically you push the electrons back down to this nitrogen, okay? And then effectively what we've done comparing this intermediate to that intermediate is we've traded out a bond of fluorine to a bond to the enzyme, okay? And then we end up protonating again, and we're stuck, okay? Here's the trick with this. One thing I'll point out with these suicide substrates. One difference is, right, we had the fluorine leaving group. The other difference is, there is one, in relation to the enzyme, there's one big difference between this slide and that slide. What is it? Go back. Go forward. Relating to the enzyme itself, what changed? Where the hell is this? Right? We don't have that in this slide. Well, very often with suicide substrates, this nucleophile is not part of the enzyme mechanism. Okay? It doesn't always have to be. In fact, a lot of these substrates will grab nucleophilic groups that may not formally be involved in enzyme chemistry. Okay? So you have sort of an advantageous nucleophile. Okay? You attack in, and now we're stuck. Okay? The enzyme, we haven't formed our acid, we can't regenerate the pyridoxal phosphate, the enzyme is blocked. Okay? So we saw how that suicide substrate worked. We end up making this active electrophile during the enzyme mechanism itself. Okay? Any questions on that? Okay. Very often, again, what we're going to see is we see these reactions. We're going to get to a common intermediate, but the suicide substrate is going to have some sort of leaving group. It's going to have some way to generate an electrophile during the reaction itself, versus having the electrophile around when you started, like the classic irreversible inhibitors we talked about. Okay. Another one we're going to talk about is clavulanic acid. Okay. So, kind of go back. Everybody remembers penicillins. It feels like, you actually aren't going to get your med chem card for taking this class unless you hear penicillin 483 times, right? But the problem with penicillins, there's a reason why we don't use them a lot too much anymore, right? That there's broad resistance to them, okay? Partly because we have these beta-lactamases. We have enzymes in bacteria that are specifically there to hydrolyze this lactam ring open, okay? And the way they're going to work is very much like a serine protease, or like that pancreatic lipase we talked about. We have an active site serine, attacks in, opens lactam up, but then it's going to hydrolyze that off, and effectively you've disarmed the warhead. Okay? Now, what people started looking at, so you had penicillins, the bugs came up with beta-lactamases, and so we very cleverly said, okay, well, one, we're going to try to make different penicillins that the beta-lactamases won't recognize, which is why we have sort of the cephalosporins and the carbapenems and whatnot. But also, why don't we aim at the beta-lactamase itself? So now we're not aiming at the therapeutic enzyme, we're aiming at the resistance mechanism. Okay? And they found an inhibitor for that enzyme, for the beta-lactamase, through this clavulanic acid. Okay? I would ask, has anybody in here taken Augmentin? Or been given it, like if you have really bad bronchitis and pneumonia? Okay? I can tell you, so my daughter had to do this probably 2 or 3 years ago. What Augmentin is it's amoxicillin, a penicillin, compounded with clavulanic acid. So they give you the penicillin along with clavulanic acid that blocks the resistance mechanism. Okay? And so what's going to happen here, so here is the active site of the beta-lactamase. Okay? So we're going to attack in. Again, this is clavulanic acid. So again, let's look at what's the same and what's different. Okay? Here's our penicillin. Here's our clavulanic acid. So we see that we have a beta-lactam, right? We have a ring. Notice that the ring is different. And notice also we have this double bond over here. So we want to keep eyes on these things. Where we see differences, particularly we see desaturations, we see things that can be leaving groups. Keep those in mind because those might be hidden electrophiles. Okay? So we attack in, and the first 2 steps of the reaction are exactly the same. Okay? We attack in, and we end up forming this acyl enzyme intermediate, just like you would with a normal penicillin. Now, what happens here with clavulanic acid is that you then have an amine side chain, I believe it is, in the active site that will attack in to this molecule, okay, and basically displace that oxygen, okay? Now, normally, that's not going to work so well, right? You can try to attack in, but an oxygen by itself ain't a great leaving group, okay? Having NH attack in and getting O- out, it's not going to go. Like, same here, you don't see that reaction with penicillin, because you're not going to kick S- out by itself just for no reason, Okay? Between sulfur and nitrogen, sulfur is the better nucleophile. But what can happen here, because we have that double bond next door, it can go out and basically grab a proton from a base nearby, and what we've done is we've made a covalent bond between the nitrogen, the amine side chain, and the clavulanate, and we end up kicking out this ketone. Okay? That's the difference. We basically we now have a second connection in the active site. Okay? And notice again that we don't have any evidence right now that that amine was in any way involved in the classical beta-lactamase hydrolysis of a penicillin. We might just be grabbing it because it's in the neighborhood. Okay? Then what happens is you can protonate that nitrogen, okay? And we end up kicking out what remains of the clavulanate, almost all of it, right? We end up extruding this molecule, okay? But what you've got now is we now have a covalent connection between the serine and the other group in the active site. So effectively, you have modified two groups in the active site of the beta-lactamase. It is no longer catalytically competent. Okay? So again, notice what happened here is we're generating the electrophile during the reaction. Because in this reaction, where's the best electrophile? It's definitely the beta-lactam. But as you do it, we have this secondary electrophile that activates, and we go forward. Okay? So another example of a suicide substrate. Now I will say, so there's two, well, there's more than two classes. There's three, I believe, beta-lactamases. But broadly speaking, there's beta-lactamases that work like this, and then there are metallo-beta-lactamases. So in a metallo-beta-lactamase, what you have, so in a beta-lactamase, right, we have our serine side chain. That's serving as our nucleophile. And a metallo-beta-lactamase, what you have is some sort of metal, usually a divalent, and you either have a metal-bound hydroxide, or you have that metal-bound hydroxide serving as a general base. Okay? Two different classes. So what we're showing here is beta-lactamases, right? We're using the serine on the enzyme. Would clavulanic acid, just looking at it, would it be a good inhibitor for a metallo-beta-lactamase? Okay, here we're using the serine, here we're using the water for the nucleophile in this first step. Who thinks clavulanic acid would work against a metallo-beta-lactamase? Who thinks it won't? We have some very, very shy opinions. Okay, what we want to look at again is we're modifying groups on the enzyme. If with a metallo-beta-lactamase, the actual nucleophile, the thing that's activated to attack is water. So if you do, let's assume the mechanism is similar, which data suggests it is. This would be water to attack in. That would mean that this molecule is not bound to the enzyme. Okay? Which probably means that you have a non-trivial chance of that molecule, even if the reaction occurs, this molecule diffusing out of the active site before you do that second step. Okay? So I will tell you that clavulanate does not effectively inhibit metallo-beta-lactamases, which is a royal pain in the toot, because they came up with clavulanic acid about 10 to 15 years ago, worked really, really well. Just out of curiosity, anybody want to guess what a major resistance mechanism in bugs toward penicillins is now? The metallo-beta-lactamases. The bugs learned, right? And so now there's a big push in the field to make metallo-beta-lactamase inhibitors because clavulanate won't go there. Okay? But again, it's an example that we have a molecule that you're generating the electrophile as part of the enzymatic mechanism. Okay? Now, generally speaking, if you can do a suicide substrate like this, it's considered to be a safer drug or something that has a lower propensity for side effects because in and of itself, it's not going to react willy-nilly everywhere like something like a fluorophosphonate or a alkyl chloride would. Okay? Because you're generating the electrophile only in the context of the enzyme active site. Any questions on that? Okay. Last one I'll mention briefly because it's in from the book, and I know you guys would ask me about this. First off, on this telanilic acid, no, I don't expect you to remember every step of it, because oh my dear God. Okay? But this would be another example where you have this telanilic acid. It's not actually a great inhibitor. Okay? Until it hits the cytochrome P450. We're going to talk about these later in the course. CP450s are generic enzymes that do oxidation in metabolism, primary metabolism. Okay? What this enzyme does is it takes this thiophene ring in the beginning and we're oxidizing it. Notice how we put that oxygen on it. Okay? Once you oxidize telanilic acid, it goes from ho hum, I'm hanging out, life is awesome, to oh my dear God, I want electrons. Okay? So the oxidation step itself makes it an electrophile. Okay? Then we go through and we end up alkylating the enzyme through a thiol with that group, and then you go through a whole bunch of steps. Again, don't worry about knowing every step in this pathway. Okay? But you end up alkylating the enzyme and forming this stable alkylated species that is irreversibly inhibited. Okay? Again, the difference here is the initial molecule is not an electrophile. Okay? It's not electrophilic until you oxidize it. Okay? So what you want to know about this is that it's now being activated by oxidation. Okay, so we have examples. In alanine transaminase, this was activated effectively following nucleophilic attack by fluorine leaving. Okay? Here, we're activated by a nucleophilic attack generating a better electrophile. With telanilic acid, we're being activated by oxidation. In each case, we have an enzyme-catalyzed reaction leading to formation of electrophile that then locks the molecule into the enzyme active site. Okay? The other thing we're noticing here to reinforce it, anything we're doing that's mechanism-based is in the active site. Okay? There are no mechanism-based allosteric inhibitors because we're using the active site itself. Okay. So to kind of reinforce this, I pulled this from a recent drug discovery review, okay, on covalent inhibitors. Here are a whole bunch of different molecules that in and of themselves are inert. Okay? But upon metabolism, what we're going to talk about is when we get into pharmacokinetics. Okay? Primary metabolism tends to be oxidations. Okay? That upon oxidation, they become reactive electrophiles. Okay? So, for example, okay, acetaminophen, which I pretty much guarantee everybody here has taken at one point or another, right? When it's oxidized, this actually is what the active ingredient is relative to your actual, like, affecting pain. It gets oxidized to that, and it's an electrophile. Okay? Bromobenzene. This is not a drug, obviously, but it oxidizes, and you form these epoxides. I will point out this is the reason why benzene is much worse for you than toluene is. Okay? Here's the issue. When you oxidize toluene, you guys all remember what toluene looks like. Oh, jeez. 275 was so long ago. You take that molecule, and we oxidize toluene. What it's going to do, well, let me guess. If you take this molecule, I'm taking you back, you hit it with permanganate, or you hit it with a strong oxidant, what happens to it?
COH.
Right, we end up forming an exosilic acid. We oxidize the benzylic position, and we go to benzylic acid. Okay. Is that an electrophile? The acid?
No.
Trust me, no. Your inclination is no. It's not an electrophile. Right? It's not very reactive. It also makes it a heck of a lot more water soluble. With benzene or bromobenzene, we don't have that benzylic position. Is that electrophile right there? The epoxide? Yeah. This is what starts mucking with your DNA. Okay? That's why benzene is so much more toxic for you than toluene is, because of the oxidation pathways we're going to talk about. Okay? And then down here, I love this example. We have urushiol oil. They get oxidized over here. Anybody know the most common reason you would run into this compound? This is the active ingredient in poison ivy. And everyone's eyes go, right. This is fine for you. This makes you think life is a living hell. Okay, this is what makes you itch. Okay, the actual oil itself doesn't get you. It's when it metabolizes that gets you because you're making these electrophiles. Okay, we don't say now. Looking at this, and we'll talk about this more when we do PK. Why the hell would our body be doing oxidation? Because when we oxidize, we're making all these really awesome electrophiles that can muck up proteins, cause immune responses. What does oxidation give us? Okay, so what we're making these more electrophilic, right? Now, if we don't muck with the protein, what do we think the next step on this molecule? If you threw this in water, what's going to happen? It's going to open. It's going to hydrolyze. And we're going to get a diol. What the oxidations will do very often is they make things more water soluble. Okay, which is what your body has to do to excrete them. Okay, which is always sort of the plus and minus of primary metabolism. When we do oxidation, it makes things that might be more dangerous for you. When we do drug design, we talk about marketing, you have to figure out all the metabolites of whatever you're throwing in the body. But the flip side is, the idea is to make the molecule more soluble so that either you can flush it directly out with water, or in secondary metabolism, we're going to actually have specific enzymes that use electrophiles to grab these molecules, conjugate them up, and get them out. Okay? Okay. Last thing we'll talk about today is going to be targeting. We talked about isoforms before, right? We talked about enzymes. One thing that's a big move in medchem right now is targeting different enzyme isoforms. Okay? So, for example, this is an old COX inhibitor. It's an anti-inflammatory. There are two major cyclooxygenases, 1 and 2. Okay? One of them is always on. The other one's only on when you have inflammation, which is COX-2. Okay? This is a pan-COX inhibitor. The problem is, there's sometimes when you want cyclooxidase activity, so you don't want to knock everything out. You want to basically block COX-2 without blocking COX-1. So we have some selective, the idea is to make selective COX-2 inhibitors. So they made this molecule, valdecoxib, which is a selective inhibitor. It was withdrawn in 2005. The reason that was is because this other selective inhibitor was withdrawn in 2004. We've talked about this before, if anybody remembers Vioxx. Okay? It's a selective COX-2 inhibitor which has the unfortunate side effect of causing strokes and heart attacks, which they did not realize until several years after it was on the market. Okay? And so they pulled this off, and if you read the literature, as soon as they pulled this off, that got pulled off a year later, even though the data wasn't like they had strong data for this one causing heart attacks, but because that went away, the tolerance for risk went nowhere. Okay? And then we have that one far on the end that is still available. Okay? So far, that's still on the market. Okay? But that's the issue. You're trying to target one isoform versus the other. Another example here, I pulled this from a review, trying to target different isoforms of histone deacetylases. This is from a few years back. There are all these molecules. A good number of these have gone into clinical trials because there's, I forget how many HDACs there are. I think there's up to 14 of them. The idea is trying to inhibit specific enzymes versus inhibiting all of them because different histone deacetylases are involved in the regulation of different genes. So this is one of the growing parts right now in drug development is isoform-specific targeting. But again, you have to know a lot about the different isoforms in order to target one and not the other. Okay? And then the last two slides are for sort of you to read through. Just get the idea of in different contexts or different therapeutic uses, what type of enzyme targets there might be for medication. Okay? So any questions on any of that? No? Okay. So I'll finish with that. We'll be starting with receptors on Tuesday.